The sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Sarah Winters stood clutching her son's hand, watching the crowd of potential buyers gather for the county property auction. A warm summer breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and opportunity, but Sarah's stomach knotted with anxiety. 3 months ago, she'd been Sarah Patterson chemistry teacher with a comfortable suburban home. Now she was just another divorcee with empty pockets and a 12-year-old son depending on her for everything. Ethan squeezed her hand, looking up with eyes that held too much understanding for a child his age. Her son had grown up fast these past few months, watching their life disintegrate under the weight of David's failed business ventures and mounting debts. The foreclosure notice had been the final blow, stripping away their last pretense of stability. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the courthouse lawn, announcing the first property, a 3-bedroom ranch with a tax lien. Sarah watched as bidding quickly escalated beyond anything she could afford. Her entire net worth sat in her wallet, $73 and change. It might as well have been 73 cents for all the good it would do here. One by one, properties sold to investors and locals with actual money. Sarah remained, though she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was simple desperation. They had nowhere to go after the motel money ran out next week. Or perhaps it was the stubborn determination that had carried her through the divorce, refusing to accept there wasn't some way forward. The auctioneer's voice broke through her thoughts. Item 14, mountain cabin on 5 acres Blackwell Ridge. No utility structure in severe disrepair. Opening bid $500. Silence fell over the crowd. Even the bargain hunters seemed uninterested in a dilapidated cabin miles from nowhere. The auctioneer repeated the opening bid, lowering it to $200, then $100. Still no takers. $50. The auctioneer's voice held a note of desperation now. Sarah felt a sudden, inexplicable certainty wash over her. Without planning to speak, she called out, "I'll give you 50 cents. Laughter rippled through the crowd. A man in an expensive suit smirked, whispering something to his companion that made them both chuckle. The auctioneer squinted in her direction, clearly trying to determine if she was serious. 50 cents, ma'am. This is a legal auction, not a joke. Sarah straightened her shoulders, ignoring the heat creeping up her neck. I have 50 cents and you have no other bidders. The county wants this property off the tax rolls, don't they? More laughter, but the auctioneer conferred briefly with a county official. Sarah held her breath. This was madness. A cabin with no electricity, no running water, miles from civilization. But it was shelter. It was something they could own outright, something no one could take away. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Sold to the lady for 50 cents. Please see the clerk for paperwork. The wealthy man who'd been laughing earlier approached as Sarah fumbled in her purse for 2 quarters. You do realize you've just bought a worthless pile of rotting timber, right? That place hasn't been inhabited since old Sullivan disappeared decades ago. You'd be better off sleeping in your car. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is bet everything on nothing at all. The man shook his head, walking away with a dismissive wave. Sarah turned to find Ethan watching her with wide eyes. Are we really going to live in a cabin in the mountains? She pressed the deed into her pocket, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life or somehow found their salvation. We're going to Truckbine. The drive to Blackwell Ridge took nearly 2 hours the last 40 minutes on a rutted dirt road that threatened to shake their aging Honda Civic apart. With each mile, civilization fell away. First the suburbs, then the small towns, then even the scattered farmhouses, until there was nothing but dense forest and the occasional dirt track branching off the main road. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, ignoring the warning signals from her rational mind. This was madness. She'd brought her child to the wilderness with no plan beyond a desperate gamble on a 50-cent shelter. Her ex-husband would have a field day if he knew. More evidence of her impulsive decision-making that he'd cited during custody hearings. The GPS lost signal 20 minutes ago. Now they navigated by the crude map the county clerk had sketched on the back of their deed. Turn left at the lightning-struck pine the clerk had written. Sarah spotted the twisted, blackened tree and steered the car onto an even narrower track. Ethan pressed his face against the window, unusually quiet. The motel had been bad enough. Thin walls carrying arguments from neighboring rooms, the constant worry about their dwindling funds. But at least it had electricity running, water, a connection to the world they knew. This felt like driving off the edge of the map. The track curved sharply around a massive boulder, and suddenly their new home appeared through the trees. Sarah's heart sank. Cabin was a generous description for the structure before them, a small single-story building with a sagging roof and boarded windows. The porch listed dangerously to one side, rotted steps leading up to a door secured with a rusted padlock. "Home sweet home," Ethan muttered, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah forced a smile, refusing to let him see her doubt. "It's a fixer-upper, but it's ours. No rent, no mortgage. Just a place to catch our breath and figure out next steps." She parked the car and they approached, cautiously stepping over fallen branches and knee-high weeds. Sarah tried the padlock, finding it solid despite the rust. The key from the county clerk, an old iron thing that looked like something from a historical museum, fit surprisingly well. The lock opened with a reluctant screech. The smell hit them first. Musty air thick with decades of abandonment. Sarah pushed the door wider, letting sunlight spill into the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the beams, illuminating a space that was surprisingly intact despite its neglect. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom at the back, and a narrow ladder suggested some kind of loft space above. Sarah stepped inside, testing the floorboards. They creaked, but held firm. The roof had leaked in several places, evident from water stains on the wooden ceiling, but the bones of the structure seemed sound. Handcrafted beams supported the roof, their joinery speaking of skilled craftsmanship from another era. Ethan sneezed as he entered, disturbing decades of dust. No electricity, no running water. "How are we supposed to live here?" Sarah set her jaw, refusing to be deterred by reality just yet. People lived without modern conveniences for thousands of years. "We'll adapt. I know about chemical purification from teaching, and there must be a water source nearby. No one builds a cabin without access to water." She moved to the boarded windows, working her fingers under the edge of one plank. The wood gave way easily, rotted by years of exposure. Sunlight flooded the room, revealing details hidden in the gloom. A wood-burning stove in the kitchen area, shelves built into the walls, a handmade table shoved against one corner. More importantly, she could now see that while neglected, the cabin wasn't destroyed. The structure was solid, the damage primarily cosmetic. "We'll need to fix the roof before anything else." Then the windows. Sarah mentally cataloged the tasks ahead, the impossibility of their situation temporarily overwhelmed by practical considerations. Get the chimney inspected to make sure we can safely use the fireplace. Find the water source and test it for safety. Ethan wandered toward the back room, his initial skepticism giving way to cautious exploration. "Mom, come look at this." The bedroom was smaller than the main area, with built-in shelves along one wall and a window facing east toward the ridge. Like the front room, it showed signs of abandonment, but not destruction. Ethan was examining the windowsill, his finger tracing something carved into the wood. "T.S. 1967, he read. Someone left their initials. Sarah ran her hand over the carefully carved letters. "Someone made this place their home once. We can do it again." They spent the remaining daylight hours taking inventory of their new home and immediate surroundings. The property included about 5 acres of wooded land that sloped down toward a creek about 200 yards behind the cabin. The water ran clear and cold, though Sarah collected samples in empty water bottles to test later. A dilapidated outhouse stood at a discreet distance from the cabin, its structure questionable but potentially salvageable. Inside, they swept decades of dust and debris from the floors, uncovering solid hardwood beneath. They removed the remaining boards from the windows, allowing cross-ventilation to clear the musty air. The furnishings were sparse but serviceable. The table and 2 chairs, a metal frame bed with no mattress in the bedroom, shelves, and hooks built into the walls for storage. As the sun began to set, they unrolled sleeping bags on the freshly swept floor of the main room. Their car contained everything they still owned: clothes, a camp stove, some basic tools, and the few personal items they'd managed to keep through the financial collapse of their previous life. Tomorrow they would bring it all inside, but tonight they were too exhausted from the day's discoveries. Sarah's chemistry teacher background had already proven valuable, helping her assess their most critical needs. Water, shelter, heat, food. The hierarchy hadn't changed since prehistoric times. The creek provided water, though she'd need to verify its purity. The cabin offered shelter, albeit in need of significant repairs. Heat would come from the fireplace and wood stove, assuming both could be made operational. Food remained the most pressing ongoing concern, with their limited funds needing careful rationing. Lying in her sleeping bag as darkness enveloped the cabin, Sarah pulled out her worn leather journal, a birthday gift from Ethan before everything fell apart. Its pages now contained careful lists and calculations tracking every expense and mapping their uncertain future. By the light of a battery-powered lantern, she began a new entry. Day 1 at Blackwell Ridge. Cabin better than expected. Solid foundation, good bones. Roof needs immediate repair. 3 leaks identified. Creek approx. 200 yards south appears clean, but requires testing. Outhouse structurally questionable, but workable. No sign of wildlife intrusion in cabin. Priorities: 1 roof repairs. 2 window sealing. Fireplace/chimney inspection. 4 water testing. 5 sustainable food plan. She closed the journal, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. In the city, there had been constant background noise. Traffic, neighbors, air conditioning, the hum of electronics. Here the silence was occasionally broken by the call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant gurgle of the creek. Different, but not necessarily worse. Beside her, Ethan's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. Despite everything, her son seemed to take each new challenge in stride, his resilience both heartbreaking and inspiring. Children shouldn't have to be this adaptable, this understanding of adult failures and limitations. Yet here he was, sleeping peacefully in an abandoned cabin because his mother had spent their last 50 cents on a desperate gamble. Sarah's scientific mind never stopped calculating probabilities, and she knew the odds were stacked against them. But for the first time since the divorce, they had something that was truly theirs. Not borrowed, not rented, not held at the mercy of someone else's decisions. That had to count for something. The morning light filtered through the uncovered windows, casting geometric patterns across the wooden floor. Sarah woke with the sun, a habit formed over the past difficult months, when every hour mattered in the scramble to rebuild their lives. Ethan still slept, curled in his sleeping bag, his dark hair falling across his forehead. She allowed him this peace, knowing the day ahead would demand much from both of them. Outside, the mountain air carried a sharpness that cleared her head. Standing on the porch, which was more stable than it had appeared yesterday, Sarah surveyed their property. The forest pressed close on 3 sides, mostly pine and oak, with undergrowth creating natural boundaries. To the east, the land opened up slightly, offering a view across the valley to distant ridges layered in blue haze. Sarah made her way to the creek, listening to the forest wake around her. Birds called from the canopy, unseen creatures rustled in the undergrowth, and the constant music of running water grew louder as she approached. The creek itself was about 8 feet wide, running over smooth stones with occasional deeper pools. Sarah knelt beside one such pool, dipping her hand into the cold water. Her chemistry knowledge would be useful here, testing for contaminants, understanding how to purify water for drinking, recognizing potential hazards. Returning to the cabin, she found Ethan awake and examining the stone fireplace with curious hands. The hearth was solid, built from river rocks, carefully fitted together without mortar. The chimney appeared intact, though Sarah made a mental note to check for cracks or blockages before risking a fire. Together, they explored the cabin more thoroughly in the revealing morning light. The main room's dimensions became clearer, about 20 feet square, with the kitchen area defined by the wood stove and a dry sink along the north wall. The back bedroom was roughly half that size, with the built-in shelves and the window bearing the carved initials. The ladder they'd noticed yesterday led to a small loft space under the peak of the roof, just large enough for storage, or perhaps a sleeping area for Ethan once they'd checked its structural integrity. As they moved a heavy cabinet to better access one of the windows, Ethan discovered a folded paper that had been trapped behind it. The yellowed sheet contained a single line of faded handwriting. "The treasure isn't beneath the ground, but within it." Ethan held up the paper, his expression curious. "What do you think it means?" Examined the cryptic message, turning it over to find the page blank otherwise. Could be nothing. Someone's philosophical musings. Or maybe related to mining. These mountains have a history of silver mining. She tucked the paper into her journal, filing away the mystery for later consideration. Their immediate concerns were far more practical than riddles left by previous occupants. They spent the morning retrieving their belongings from the car and setting up the camp stove on the porch for a simple breakfast. Sarah had packed their remaining food with care, Oatmeal, dried fruit, canned beans, rice pasta, powdered milk. Enough to last 2 weeks if they were careful, by which time she needed a plan for replenishment. After eating, they began the most urgent task, assessing the roof damage. From inside, they'd identified 3 distinct leaks, but the full extent of the problem required external inspection. With no ladder tall enough to reach the roof, Sarah cautiously climbed onto the hood of their car, then used the porch roof as a step to reach the main roof. The wooden shingles were in worse condition than she'd feared. Many rotted through completely, others hanging loose and ready to fail with the next rain. Ethan stood below, handing up tools as Sarah examined the damage. "Mom, will this really work?" Living here, Sarah paused, considering her answer carefully. The odds were against them, but she refused to burden her son with the full weight of adult worry. "It's going to be hard work, but yes, it can work. People have lived in places like this for centuries. We're just rediscovering old skills." From the roof, she could see farther across their property and the surrounding wilderness. No other cabins were visible, though smoke from a distant chimney suggested they weren't completely alone in these mountains. The isolation was both blessing and burden. No prying eyes to judge their unconventional choices, but also no immediate help in case of emergency. By mid-afternoon, they had removed the worst of the damaged shingles, leaving several holes that needed covering before nightfall. A tarp from the car secured with rocks and rope provided temporary protection. Tomorrow, they would need to find the materials for proper repairs, which meant a trip to the nearest town, wherever that might be. As Sarah worked, her mind cataloged each problem with the systematic approach of a scientist. The roof required new shingles. The windows needed reglazing, or at least plastic coverings for the coming winter. The chimney should be professionally inspected, though they couldn't afford that luxury. The outhouse needed structural reinforcement and sanitation considerations. Water from the creek required testing and a system for regular collection. Food would mean learning to garden, forage, perhaps even hunt, all skills she'd never needed in her suburban chemistry teacher life. Each challenge seemed insurmountable alone, yet together they formed a project, not just survival, but transformation. The cabin wasn't just shelter, it was a second chance disguised as desperation. While searching the kitchen area for anything useful, Ethan discovered a drawer containing several old publications. Mining journals from the 1960s, geological surveys of the region, and a handwritten notebook with observations about promising silver veins in the North Ridge outcropping. The previous owner had clearly been interested in more than simple mountain living. "These might be valuable," Ethan suggested, leafing through a journal with diagrams of ore samples. "Maybe we could sell them." Sarah examined one of the publications, noting the detailed maps of local geological formations. "More likely valuable for the information they contain. These mountains have a history of silver mining. Knowing where to look could be useful." She added the materials to her growing collection of items requiring further investigation once their basic needs were secured. The cabin was slowly revealing its secrets, hinting at a previous occupant with interests beyond mere survival. As sunset approached, they cleared enough space in the main room to create a comfortable living area. Their sleeping bags remained on the floor, but Sarah had unpacked their few books, arranged cooking supplies near the wood stove, and set up a battery-powered lantern on the handmade table. These small touches of familiarity helped transform the abandoned cabin into something approaching home. Sarah heated water on the camp stove for instant soup, their first hot meal in their new dwelling. As they ate, sitting cross-legged on sleeping bags, she noticed Ethan's gaze lingering on the carved initials visible through the backroom doorway. "TS 1967, he repeated. "Do you think that's who left all the mining stuff? What happened to them?" Sarah considered the question. The county clerk hadn't offered much information beyond the property's tax delinquent status. "Old Sullivan disappeared decades ago," the wealthy man at the auction had said. "Just another mystery to solve. We'll find out more when we go into town tomorrow. For now, let's focus on making this place livable." She opened her journal, noting their progress and planning tomorrow's tasks with the methodical precision that had become her emotional anchor. Roof temporarily patched, windows cleared, found geological publications suggesting mining history, creek water collected for testing. Priorities for Town 1, roofing materials. 2, basic groceries. Information about previous owner as for water testing chemicals. That night, exhaustion from physical labor brought deep sleep despite their primitive accommodations. Sarah dreamed of silver veins running through stone of water, flowing over precious metals of treasures hidden in plain sight. The cryptic note echoed in her unconscious mind, "The treasure isn't beneath the ground, but within it." The trip to town the next day proved both challenging and enlightening. Pineville was the nearest settlement, a small mountain community 22 miles from their cabin. The hardware store owner, a weathered man named Jim Harris, raised his eyebrows when Sarah mentioned Blackwell Ridge. "You're living in old Sullivan's place. That cabin's been empty since the early 70s. Most folks figured it would collapse into the ground eventually." Sarah purchased roofing materials and basic supplies, stretching their limited funds as far as possible. "Do you know anything about Sullivan?" The initials TS are carved in one of the windowsills dated 1967. Jim leaned against the counter, his expression contemplative. "Thomas Sullivan. Geologist or mining engineer, something like that. Showed up here in the mid-60s, kept mostly to himself. Smart fellow by all accounts, but odd. Spent all his time in the mountains mapping and taking samples. Then one day he just wasn't around anymore. Some say he struck it rich and moved away. Others think he had trouble with mining companies wanting his research. The most likely story is he just died up there alone." The librarian offered more concrete information when Sarah inquired later that day. The local history section contains several references to Thomas Sullivan, including a newspaper article from 1965 announcing his purchase of the Blackwell Ridge property described as previously owned by the defunct Blackwell Mining Company. A photograph accompanied the article, a lean, serious man with intelligent eyes and premature gray at his temples. The caption identified him as Thomas Sullivan, formerly of Denver, Colorado, though now residing in Pineville. Sarah made photocopies of the relevant articles, adding them to her growing collection of information about their cabin's previous occupant. The mystery of Thomas Sullivan provided a welcome distraction from their immediate challenges, a puzzle to solve between the endless tasks of making their shelter habitable. The following weeks fell into a pattern of hard physical labor and incremental improvements. Sarah and Ethan replaced damaged roof shingles, sealed windows with plastic sheeting, cleared brush from around the cabin, and established a reliable system for collecting and purifying creek water. Each day brought new challenges and small victories, their bodies growing stronger as they adapted to mountain living. Sarah began homeschooling Ethan using their surroundings as a living classroom. Botany lessons involved identifying edible plants in the forest. Physics came alive through the mechanical advantages of levers and pulleys used in their repair work. Chemistry found practical application in water purification and understanding the properties of materials they salvaged. Ethan thrived under this unconventional education, his natural curiosity engaged by hands-on learning. He developed surprising aptitude with tools his smaller hands able to reach places Sarah couldn't access. Together, they became a team, their shared purpose healing some of the wounds left by the collapse of their previous life. The cabin gradually transformed under their care. The roof no longer leaked, the windows admitted light, while keeping out drafts, and the fireplace passed Sarah's careful inspection, providing warmth as autumn brought cooler temperatures. They scavenged materials from abandoned structures deeper in the forest. An old hunting camp yielded a serviceable mattress for the metal bed frame, while a collapsed shed provided usable lumber for repairs. Each evening, Sarah documented their progress in her journal, the pages filling with practical observations, expenses, tracked to the penny, and notes about Thomas Sullivan gleaned from town visits and discoveries within the cabin itself. The mining journals proved particularly interesting, containing detailed observations about geological formations throughout the region, with special attention to silver deposits. One crisp October morning, as Sarah and Ethan worked to reinforce the sagging porch, a pickup truck rumbled up their dirt track, their first visitor since moving to the cabin. A gray-haired woman emerged regarding them with open curiosity. "I'm Martha Blackwell. My family owned this mountain before the mining company bought it back in the 30s. Heard in town someone was living up here again." Sarah introduced herself, and Ethan, conscious of her worn jeans and work-roughened hands. Martha's gaze took in the repairs, the neatly stacked firewood, the garden they'd started with seeds from the hardware store. "You've done more with this place in a month than anyone expected. Most folks thought you'd give up after the first rain." The older woman became a regular visitor, bringing occasional treats, fresh eggs from her chickens, apples, from her orchard advice about surviving mountain winters. More importantly, she brought stories about Thomas Sullivan, whom she had known personally. Thomas was running from something, though he never said what. Brilliant man knew more about these mountains' geology than folks who'd lived here all their lives. He was convinced there were untapped silver deposits throughout this region. Spent years mapping and sampling, documenting everything with scientific precision. Why didn't he file mining claims? Sarah asked, thinking of the detailed surveys they'd found. Martha shrugged, said something once about responsible development and corporate exploitation. I gathered he had ethical concerns about how mining was conducted, wanted to ensure any silver found would benefit local communities rather than distant corporations. These conversations added depth to Sarah's understanding of the mysterious TS, whose presence seemed to linger in the cabin despite his long absence. His bookshelves still held technical volumes on geology and mining. His handcrafted furniture bore the marks of careful craftsmanship. Even the layout of the cabin, oriented to capture maximum sunlight, positioned near the creek, but safely above flood level. Book of thoughtful planning. As October progressed, Sarah's attention turned to winter preparations. Martha's warnings about mountain snowfalls added urgency to their work. They gathered and split firewood, insulated the cabin's walls with materials salvaged from the abandoned hunting camp, and constructed a cold storage area for preserving food. Their financial situation remained precarious. Sarah's small divorce settlement had nearly run out despite her careful rationing. She began taking odd jobs in Pineville, tutoring high school students in science, helping at the hardware store during busy periods, editing technical documents for a small engineering firm that maintained an office in town. These jobs provided barely enough income for essentials, with nothing left for luxuries or emergencies. On a particularly cold afternoon, as Sarah and Ethan worked to reinforce the outhouse before winter storms arrived, Ethan lost his footing on the frozen ground. Reaching to steady himself, he put his weight against a rotted floorboard that gave way, suddenly sending him tumbling halfway through the structure. Sarah rushed to pull him free, checking for injuries with terrified hands. Ethan seemed more surprised than hurt, brushing dirt from his clothes as he pointed to something visible through the broken floor. "Mom, there's something down there. Looks like a metal box or container." Kneeling beside the hole, Sarah directed the beam of her flashlight into the space beneath the outhouse. What appeared to be a small metal footlocker sat nestled against one of the foundation posts, partially concealed by dirt and debris. The structure had been built directly over this hidden container, suggesting intentional concealment rather than coincidence. With careful maneuvering, they managed to extract the locker without further damaging the outhouse. The metal was tarnished but intact, secured with a padlock that had succumbed to decades of rust and exposure. A firm twist with pliers broke the corroded mechanism, allowing the lid to open with a reluctant creak. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth bundles carefully sealed against moisture, lay a collection of documents, maps, and what appeared to be ore samples. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the first bundle, unwrapping the protective covering to reveal papers that had maintained remarkable preservation despite their age and hiding place. Mining claim certificates prepared but never filed. Detailed topographical maps with locations marked using symbols and coordinates. Letters written in a careful hand, addressed but never sent. And beneath it all, a leather-bound journal with the initials TS embossed on the cover. Thomas Sullivan. So that's who TS was, Ethan whispered, peering over Sarah's shoulder at their discovery. The implications slowly crystallized in Sarah's mind. Thomas Sullivan hadn't been merely interested in the region's geology. He had discovered something significant enough to document in exhaustive detail, something he had chosen to hide rather than claim publicly. "Look at these," Ethan said carefully, lifting a small leather pouch from the bottom of the locker. Inside were dozens of rock samples, each labeled with coordinates and dates. Several displayed the distinctive metallic gleam that Sarah recognized from her chemistry background. Silver ore and apparently high-grade specimens based on the visible content. They carried their discovery back to the cabin, spreading the contents across the handmade table for proper examination. The maps revealed a landscape mapped with scientific precision. Elevations, water sources, geological formations, all documented with professional skill. Several locations were marked with symbols that, when cross-referenced with Sullivan's journal, indicated silver deposits of varying richness. The journal itself provided the narrative context for these technical documents. Thomas Sullivan had indeed been a mining engineer from Denver, part of a family mining business he had abandoned for reasons initially unclear. He had purchased the Blackwell Ridge property specifically for its proximity to geological formations he believed contained untapped silver deposits. And based on the samples and documentation, he had been correct. Sarah turned the pages of the journal with growing fascination, reading Sullivan's neat handwriting by lantern light as Ethan examined the maps and samples. Sullivan's early entries focused on technical observations, ore quality, vein thickness, extraction challenges. But as the journal progressed, his writing became more philosophical, questioning the ethics of mineral extraction and expressing concerns about environmental impact. June 15, 1967. The silver content in today's samples exceeds anything previously documented in this region. Conservative estimates suggest commercial viability far beyond initial projections. Yet I find myself increasingly concerned about what mining operations would do to this landscape. The standard extraction methods would devastate the watershed for decades to come. August 3, 1967. Another letter from Western Mining Corporation today. Their offers grow more substantial with each communication. They sense the value of my research but understand nothing of its broader implications. To them, these mountains represent only profit margins and shareholder value. October 17, 1967. Made the decision today to withhold my findings from public record. Instead of filing claims immediately, I will complete the documentation and preserve everything for future consideration. Perhaps in time, extraction technologies will advance to permit responsible development. Until then, the silver remains safer in the ground than in corporate ledgers. The final entries describe Sullivan's methodical concealment of his research, the careful wrapping of documents, the construction of hiding places throughout the property, the decision to leave sufficient clues that someone committed to the place might eventually discover what he had found. I leave this record for whoever follows, whenever that may be. The silver deposits documented herein are real and substantial. They represent wealth that could transform lives, but only if approached with respect for the land that holds them. May whoever finds these papers understand that true value lies not in extraction alone, but in responsible stewardship. Sarah closed the journal, her mind racing with implications. Thomas Sullivan had discovered commercially viable silver deposits throughout the region surrounding their cabin. He had documented everything necessary for legal claims, then deliberately hidden that information rather than sell it to corporate interests or exploit it himself. And now, through pure chance, a 50-cent auction bid, a rotted floorboard, a stumble, that information had come to them. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, his expression a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Does this mean we're rich? Sarah looked at the materials spread across the table, the culmination of one man's life work, potentially worth millions if the silver deposits were as substantial as Sullivan's documentation suggested. Yet the journal also contained clear warnings about the ethical complexities of mineral extraction concerns that resonated with her own environmental awareness. It means we found something important, something Thomas Sullivan thought was worth protecting. We need to understand exactly what we've discovered before making any decisions. She opened her own journal, making notes with the methodical precision that had become her anchor through uncertainty. Found hidden documents from Thomas Sullivan T.S., detailed maps of silver deposits throughout region, mining claim certificates prepared but never filed, journal expressing ethical concerns about extraction methods, need to research, 1 current mining law, 2 environmental regulations, 3 verification of deposit locations, 4 legal status of potential claims after 50-plus years. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Sarah remained at the table reading more of Sullivan's journal by lantern light. His words painted a picture of a man caught between practical opportunity and ethical principle, between personal gain and environmental concern. The parallels to her own situation were impossible to ignore. Financial desperation balanced against long-term consequences, immediate needs against future responsibilities. The hidden documents represented possibility, a way out of their financial precarity, perhaps even prosperity. But they also represented responsibility, to the land, to the community, to Sullivan's clearly expressed wishes for responsible development. The path forward wasn't as simple as filing claims and cashing in. Sarah fell asleep at the table, Sullivan's journal open beside her own. She dreamed of silver veins running through mountain stone of water, flowing clear over precious metals, of a legacy preserved for 50 years before finding its way into desperate but careful hands. The next morning brought clarity and purpose. After breakfast, Sarah outlined a plan to Ethan, her teacher's instinct for structured problem-solving asserting itself. First, we need to understand modern mining law and environmental requirements. Then we'll verify some of Sullivan's deposit locations to confirm his documentation's accuracy. Only then can we make informed decisions about how to proceed. Their next trip to Pineville included a visit to the county courthouse, where Sarah researched current mining regulations and property records. The clerk, initially dismissive of her questions, became more helpful when Sarah mentioned Thomas Sullivan by name. Sullivan, the old hermit from Blackwell Ridge. There's been speculation about him for decades. Some folks believed he found significant silver deposits, but refused to file claims for environmental reasons. Others thought he was just another eccentric with geologist delusions. The records revealed that no active mining claims existed for the areas marked on Sullivan's maps. If his documentation proved accurate, the deposits he'd discovered remained legally unclaimed, potentially available for new filings under current law. However, the process for establishing new claims involves substantial filing fees, environmental impact studies, and ongoing maintenance costs, all beyond Sarah's current financial capacity. At the library, Sarah found information suggesting silver prices had increased tenfold since Sullivan's time, making even modest deposits potentially valuable. The economic equations Sullivan had calculated in the 1960s would need complete recalculation based on current market values and extraction costs. Armed with this preliminary information, Sarah and Ethan spent the following weekend hiking to the location Sullivan had marked as his most promising discovery, a site near Willow Creek about 3 miles from their cabin. Following his detailed maps, they found the exact outcropping he had documented, complete with the small cairns he had built to mark sampling locations. The site itself took Sarah's breath away, a natural amphitheater of stone where water had carved through layers of quartz and granite, exposing veins of mineral deposits clearly visible even to their untrained eyes. Using Sullivan's journal descriptions, they identified the characteristic signs of silver ore, collecting small samples that matched those in the leather pouch they'd discovered. Ethan moved through the site with growing excitement, his initial skepticism giving way to the thrill of confirmation. It's all exactly where he said it would be. The cairns, the outcropping, everything. Sullivan really did find silver, and lots of it based on these veins. Sarah examined the site with more measured enthusiasm, noting both the apparent richness of the deposits and the pristine nature of the surrounding ecosystem. Sullivan's ethical concerns became more understandable as she observed how mining operations would impact the watershed. The creek that provided their drinking water flowed directly from this area, connecting them intimately to any future development. On the hike back to the cabin, they discussed the implications of their discovery. The silver deposits were real, potentially valuable, and apparently unclaimed. But pursuing mining claims would require resources they didn't have, expertise they would need to acquire, and decisions about responsible development that honored both their needs and Sullivan's expressed wishes. "I think we need legal advice," Sarah concluded as they approached the cabin. "Someone who understands mining law and can help us navigate the complexities." The sight that greeted them stopped the conversation abruptly. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked in front of their cabin, and a man in an expensive suit stood on their porch examining the repairs they'd made with critical eyes. With a jolt, Sarah recognized him, the wealthy man who had mocked her 50-cent bid at the auction. Ethan moved closer to her side, his earlier excitement replaced by wariness. "Who is that? What does he want?" Sarah squared her shoulders, conscious of the rock samples in her backpack and the maps safely hidden inside the cabin. The man represented exactly the type of interest Sullivan had sought to avoid: corporate calculating focused on extraction without consideration for consequences. "I don't know, but we're about to find out." As they approached, the man turned, his expression shifting from critical assessment to practiced charm. His smile never reached his eyes, which remained cold and evaluating as he extended his hand. "Mrs. Winters, what a surprise to find you've actually made this place livable. I'm Richard Blackwell of Global Resource Enterprises. I believe we met briefly at the auction." Sarah maintained her composure, though her mind raced with questions. The Blackwell name connected to Martha, to the original property owners, to the mining company that had operated here decades ago. Global Resource Enterprises, one of the largest mining corporations in the region, known for aggressive extraction practices and minimal environmental consideration. "Mr. Blackwell, what brings you all the way up our mountain road?" His smile widened, revealing two perfect teeth. "Just checking on potential investment opportunities in the area. My company has historical interest in these mountains, dating back to my grandfather's frame. We're considering reactivating some of those interests, which might impact neighboring properties." His gaze swept over the cabin, the newly reinforced porch, the garden they had established with such effort. "You've put considerable work into this place. Admirable if perhaps misguided. This region has significant mineral potential that a small residential holding can't properly develop." The implication was clear. Their presence was an inconvenience to corporate interests, their 50-cent cabin an obstacle to extraction plans. Sarah thought of Sullivan's journals, his detailed documentation of silver deposits, his ethical concerns about corporate development. The parallels were too precise to be coincidental. "We're quite happy with our home as it is, Mr. Blackwell. Not every value can be measured in mineral rights or corporate profits." His expression hardened momentarily before the professional smile returned. "Of course. Still, should you ever reconsider your situation, my company would be interested in purchasing your property. We could offer substantially more than your current investment." He handed her a business card, the expensive paper stock incongruous against her work-roughened hands. "Something to consider as winter approaches. These mountains can be unforgiving to the unprepared." The implied threat lingered in the air as he returned to his vehicle, the powerful engine disturbing the mountain quiet as he departed. Sarah watched until the SUV disappeared around the bend, her mind connecting pieces of a puzzle that suddenly seemed much larger and more complex than before. Inside the cabin, Ethan helped her retrieve Sullivan's documents from their hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom. Together, they spread the maps across the table, examining them with new understanding. Several of the deposits Sullivan had documented most extensively fell within areas that would have been owned by the original Blackwell Mining Company. If Global Resource Enterprises had acquired those historical interests, they might have legal standing to pursue mineral rights throughout the region, except where valid competing claims existed. Sullivan's unfiled documentation represented exactly that possibility. Competing claims based on his detailed geological work. Claims that Sarah and Ethan might now be positioned to file if they could navigate the legal and financial requirements. The visit from Richard Blackwell transformed their discovery from an interesting historical find to an urgent strategic consideration. Corporate interests were actively pursuing the very resources Sullivan had documented and chosen to protect. The 50-cent cabin had placed Sarah and Ethan directly in the path of powerful economic forces. Ethan traced one of Sullivan's maps with his finger, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. Thomas Sullivan hid these instead of filing claims or selling the information. Now we found them just as this company starts looking at the same area. That can't be coincidence. Sarah opened her journal, making notes with renewed purpose. The cryptic message they'd found weeks earlier suddenly acquired new meaning. The treasure isn't beneath the ground, but within it. Not a philosophical musing, but a literal description of silver deposits waiting to be claimed by those who understood their value and their responsibility. Visit from Richard Blackwell, Global Resource Enterprises. Clearly interested in mineral rights throughout region. Potential connection to original Blackwell Mining Company. Sullivan's documentation now appears strategically significant, not merely historical. Next steps: 1. Consult mining law attorney. 2. Assess financial requirements for filing claims. 3. Determine environmental impact of responsible development. And 4. Consider Sullivan's ethical framework as guideline for decisions. That evening, as darkness settled over the cabin and the first autumn stars appeared above the ridge, Sarah made a decision that would alter their path irrevocably. They would pursue the legacy Thomas Sullivan had preserved, not for quick profit or personal gain, but as stewards of both mineral wealth and environmental responsibility. The 50-cent cabin had offered shelter when they most needed it. Now it offered something more: purpose, opportunity, and the chance to prove that desperation could sometimes be the foundation for something unexpectedly valuable. They had bet everything on nothing at all, only to discover it might be worth millions, if they could summon the courage and wisdom to claim it properly. As Ethan slept, Sarah sat by the fireplace Sullivan had built decades earlier, reading his journal by firelight, and finding in his words the framework for their path forward. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't what we extract from the earth, but what we learn by caring for it properly. May whoever finds this understand that true wealth comes from balance, not exploitation. The mountain night wrapped around the cabin, silent witness to history repeating itself with new players, but similar stakes. In the darkness, Sarah allowed herself to hope that their desperate gamble might become something Thomas Sullivan would have recognized and approved. A second chance disguised as last resort opportunity, born from necessity and principles maintained despite practical pressures. Tomorrow they would begin the complex process of claiming what Sullivan had discovered and preserved. For tonight it was enough to know they had found not just silver, but purpose, a direction forward that honored both their needs and a legacy entrusted to them by chance and circumstance. The morning light streamed through the cabin windows as Sarah spread Thomas Sullivan's maps across the kitchen table. 3 days had passed since Richard Blackwell's unexpected visit, and she'd spent every spare moment studying Sullivan's documentation, connecting fragments of information into a coherent picture. The silver deposits were real, potentially valuable, and apparently still unclaimed, but pursuing them would require resources they didn't have and expertise they'd need to acquire. Ethan sat beside her, sorting through Sullivan's ore samples with careful hands. The crystals embedded in the rock caught the light, their metallic gleam hypnotic against the dull gray stone. Each sample carried precise labels in Sullivan's meticulous handwriting, coordinates, dates, and technical notations about silver content percentages. We need professional advice before we do anything else, especially after Blackwell's visit. The stakes are too high for guesswork. Martha Blackwell had provided a name, Jessica Morrison, an environmental attorney who specialized in mining law. The connection seemed almost too convenient, especially given the shared surname with their unwelcome visitor. But Martha had assured them Jessica was trustworthy. Family black sheep, she'd explained. Richard's second cousin who chose environmental protection over corporate profits. Family gatherings are tense. The 2-hour drive to Helena stretched their fuel budget to the breaking point, but Sarah couldn't see an alternative. Sullivan's documentation represented something potentially valuable enough to transform their situation, but only if they understood the legal landscape they were entering. Jessica Morrison's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house, its walls covered with environmental awards and framed newspaper articles about successful legal challenges to corporate mining operations. The attorney herself projected competence and intensity mid-40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing in a direct manner that wasted no words. Sarah spread Sullivan's documentation across the attorney's desk, explaining their situation with careful precision. The 50-cent cabin, the hidden documents, Blackwell's unexpected visit, each element laid out like chemical compounds in an experiment. Jessica examined the maps with growing interest, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine fascination. Sullivan's survey work is extraordinary. This level of geological detail would cost tens of thousands to produce today. What you've found could save you enormous expenses if you decide to pursue mining claims. The technical explanation that followed tested the limits of Sarah's understanding. Modern mining claims required precise documentation of mineral deposits, environmental impact studies, filing fees, and ongoing maintenance to remain valid. Sullivan's work provided the geological foundation, but they would still need to navigate complex regulatory requirements and substantial costs. The filing fees alone would be about $500 per claim, Jessica explained, tracing one of Sullivan's map sites. Then there are survey verification costs, environmental assessments, and legal expenses. We're talking at least $10,000 to establish even a single claim properly. A mountain of money they didn't have. Sarah's stomach tightened as she calculated their current resources, barely enough for winter supplies, let alone speculative mining claims. But there's something else you should consider. Jessica continued, turning to a different section of Sullivan's materials. These maps and assay reports aren't just scientifically valuable, they're historically significant. Sullivan was documenting these deposits at exactly the time the original Blackwell Mining Company was collapsing. There might be complicated ownership questions here that could work in your favor. Jessica's suggestion to start with historical research sent them to county archives housed in the basement of the Helena courthouse. There, amid dusty ledgers and faded property records, the pieces of Thomas Sullivan's story began falling into place, and the picture was far more complex than they'd imagined. Sullivan hadn't been merely a solitary prospector documenting silver deposits. He had been an heir to the Sullivan Family Mining Consortium, a significant operation with holdings throughout the region. Property records showed the consortium had been in bitter competition with Blackwell Mining Company during the 1950s and early 1960s, with both entities claiming mineral rights to overlapping territories. Most striking was a deed of trust dated 1965, the same year Sullivan purchased the cabin. The document named Thomas Sullivan as sole heir and beneficiary of all mineral rights land holdings and business interests previously held by the Sullivan Family Mining Consortium. Sarah stared at the faded document, trying to process its implications. Sullivan hadn't been running from failure. He'd been running from inheritance. He'd walked away from a family mining empire, choosing isolation over exploitation. But why? The answer emerged from correspondence archived alongside the property records. Letters between Thomas and his brother Richard Sullivan revealed escalating conflict over the direction of the family business. Thomas had opposed partnerships with larger mining corporations, arguing for sustainable practices and community benefit. Richard had pushed for expansion and profit maximization, eventually allying with Western Mining Corporation, the same company Sullivan's journals mentioned approaching him about his silver surveys. The final notice in the archives, dated December 1968, delivered the most shocking revelation. Your continued absence from required estate proceedings will result in forfeiture of inheritance rights. Legal presumption of abandonment will take effect January 1st, 1969, unless you appear before the probate court to contest this action. Sullivan had chosen to forfeit his inheritance rather than participate in mining operations he considered environmentally destructive. He had abandoned millions in family wealth, but preserved the knowledge of where valuable minerals lay, knowledge he hoped would eventually reach someone who would use it responsibly. Jessica Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim as they pieced together the historical narrative. Now the present situation makes more sense. Global Resource Enterprises. Richard Blackwell's company acquired the remnants of both Blackwell Mining and Western Mining through a series of corporate mergers in the 1990s. They've likely been searching for Sullivan's documentation for decades, knowing he had mapped deposits their predecessors couldn't locate. The drive back to the cabin felt charged with new significance. What had begun as a desperate 50-cent gamble for shelter had evolved into something far more complex. They had stumbled into a decades-old conflict between corporate mining interests and one man's environmental principles. Approaching the turnoff to their property, Sarah noticed a vehicle parked where the main road met their dirt track, a black SUV identical to Blackwell's. As they passed, the driver made no attempt to hide his surveillance, deliberately raising a camera with a long-range lens. Not even pretending to be subtle, Ethan observed, his young voice tight with tension. "They're watching us now." Sarah maintained a neutral expression until they were well past her, knuckles white on the steering wheel. The implied threat was clear. Their movements were being monitored, their interest in Sullivan's legacy noted. Corporate pressure had begun even before they'd taken any concrete action. Back at the cabin, they carefully hid Sullivan's documentation beneath the loose floorboard in the bedroom. The most valuable papers, the deed of trust and the unfiled mining certificates, went into a waterproof container buried beneath the woodpile. Sullivan had understood the value of hiding important information. They would follow his example. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would shape everything that followed. "We're going to file a claim on the Willow Creek site, just one to establish legal standing. If Sullivan's documentation is as valuable as Jessica believes, we can leverage that single claim to protect the larger territory. One claim they might afford if they depleted their meager savings and stretched their resources to the breaking point. One claim to test the legal waters and determine whether Sullivan's unfiled certificates could be converted to valid modern rights. The path forward required careful planning. Jessica Morrison agreed to help prepare their application, working for a reduced fee with the understanding that successful claims might lead to more substantial compensation later. Martha Blackwell introduced them to local residents who remembered Sullivan gathering statements that might support their historical connection to his work. Their most valuable allies emerged unexpectedly. Jim Harris, the hardware store owner, connected them with his brother-in-law, a retired geologist, who examined Sullivan's samples and pronounced them remarkably promising, consistent with commercial-grade silver ore. The local librarian discovered photographs of Sullivan working at the Willow Creek site, providing visual evidence, connecting him to the location they intended to claim. These small-town connections represented exactly what Sullivan had valued: community networks over corporate power, local knowledge over outside expertise. Sarah began to understand why he had chosen this region for his self-imposed exile. Beneath the surface of rural isolation lay webs of relationship that corporations couldn't easily penetrate or control. Their preparations did not go unnoticed. 2 weeks after their Helena trip, Sarah returned from gathering firewood to find fresh tire tracks leading to their cabin. Nothing inside appeared disturbed, but the feeling of violation lingered. Someone had been there examining their home, perhaps searching for the very documents they'd so carefully hidden. The next day brought more direct intimidation. A county vehicle arrived unannounced, an official in a pressed uniform, informing them that an anonymous complaint had triggered mandatory environmental and safety inspections of their property. The inspection found nothing actionable. Sarah's scientific background had ensured their water purification system and waste management practices exceeded requirements. But the message was clear. Their actions were being watched, and administrative harassment could be deployed at will. These corporate pressure tactics might have worked against isolated individuals, but Sarah and Ethan were no longer alone. Martha Blackwell arrived the following morning with news that spread like wildfire through the community. Global Resource Enterprises had filed preliminary paperwork for large-scale mining operations throughout the region, including areas near watershed sources for several communities. Suddenly, Sarah and Ethan's potential claim represented more than their personal interests. It became a potential legal obstacle to corporate extraction plans that threatened local water supplies. Their 50-cent cabin had placed them at the center of a conflict much larger than themselves. Jessica Morrison called with urgent advice. File your claim immediately. Global is moving faster than anticipated. They're trying to establish rights before you can challenge them with Sullivan's documentation. The filing process required Sarah to compile all of Sullivan's research into a cohesive application package, connecting his historical work to current legal requirements. Jessica's guidance proved invaluable, helping them navigate technical language and regulatory hurdles that might have otherwise been insurmountable. The completed application represented their total financial resources and countless hours of work, a desperate gamble that Sullivan's meticulous documentation would provide legal standing against corporate opposition. Sarah delivered the package to the county recorder's office, personally watching as each page received an official stamp that transformed Sullivan's hidden legacy into public record. Mining claim number 224-136, filed in the name of Sarah Winters, the clerk announced, applying the final seal. The 30-day public notice period begins immediately. 30 days for Global Resource Enterprises to marshal their legal resources against them. 30 days for the corporate attorneys to find weaknesses in their application, challenge their standing, or pressure officials to reject their claim on technical grounds. The response came faster than expected. That same afternoon, Sarah received a call from Richard Blackwell himself, his tone professionally cordial, but underlaid with steel. I understand you filed a mining claim based on some old papers you found in that cabin. I'd like to suggest a meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution before this situation becomes unnecessarily complicated. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Blackwell proposed a buyout, $50,000 for the cabin and all rights to Sullivan's documentation. A fortune compared to their current resources, but a pittance measured against the potential value of the silver deposits Sullivan had mapped. While I appreciate your interest in resolving this situation, Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, we're not interested in selling Sullivan's work. His documentation supports our claim, and we intend to pursue it through proper legal channels. The cordial facade cracked slightly. Ms. Winters, you should understand that mining law is extraordinarily complex. Global Resource has certain historical rights in this region that predate your discovery. Fighting this will cost far more than you can afford with no guarantee of success. When Sarah maintained her refusal, Blackwell's tone chilled further. I hope you understand what you're risking. Mountain winters are harsh, especially for families in precarious financial situations. Child welfare authorities take a dim view of homes without modern utilities when school-aged children are involved. The threat to their custody arrangement sent ice through Sarah's veins. Corporate pressure was extending beyond legal maneuvers to personal intimidation. They weren't just challenging her claim, they were threatening her family. Jessica Morrison's reaction to Blackwell's threat was immediate and forceful. Document everything. Record any further calls. This crosses ethical lines and we can use it against them if they persist. The attorney recommended accelerating their preparations for the inevitable legal challenge. They needed to strengthen their position before Global could mobilize its full resources against them. A breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While clearing additional storage space beneath the cabin, Ethan discovered what appeared to be another of Sullivan's hiding places, a small compartment concealed behind a false panel in a support beam. Inside lay a leather-bound book, unlike the technical journals they'd found earlier. This was Sullivan's personal diary recording, not just geological observations, but private thoughts and strategic planning. The entries revealed a man who had anticipated exactly the kind of corporate opposition they now faced. October 3, 1968. Western Mining's pressure continues to escalate. Their latest offer barely disguises the threat beneath. They want these silver deposits regardless of environmental consequences, and they have made it clear they'll use whatever methods necessary to acquire them. I've begun implementing defensive measures, hiding documentation in multiple locations, establishing observation points overlooking access roads, preparing for potential surveillance. The diary contains something even more valuable than Sullivan's private thoughts, a carefully drawn strategic map of the property showing defensive positions, escape routes, and plans for dealing with corporate interference. Sarah spread the map across the kitchen table, amazement growing as she recognized features they'd thought were random aspects of the property. The cabin's position offered clear sight lines to the main access road. The root cellar they'd been using for food storage contained a concealed extension that functioned as a communications bunker. Even the arrangement of trees around the clearing followed a pattern designed to provide cover and concealment. Sullivan hadn't just been a geologist documenting silver deposits. He'd been a strategic thinker preparing for the exact conflict they now faced, designing the property with defensive considerations that went far beyond simple privacy. Most valuable was his documentation of a hidden observation post overlooking the main road, a carefully constructed blind that offered views of anyone approaching while keeping the observer concealed. Sarah and Ethan located it that same afternoon, finding the small structure still intact beneath decades of forest growth. The next morning brought confirmation that such precautions were necessary. From the observation post, they watched as two unmarked vehicles established surveillance positions along their access road. Men with binoculars and cameras made no attempt to hide their monitoring activities, part of an intimidation strategy designed to make them feel exposed and vulnerable. Sarah activated Sullivan's communications bunker, finding the space smaller than expected, but ingeniously designed. A hand crank radio still functioned, allowing contact with Martha Blackwell and through her Jessica Morrison. This alternate communication channel proved crucial when they discovered their cell phone service had been mysteriously interrupted, an infrastructure maintenance issue that affected only their specific location. Corporate pressure escalated over the following days. An environmental inspector appeared citing an anonymous complaint about contamination from their water purification system. County officials suddenly discovered irregularities in their property registration that required immediate attention. A social services representative conducted an unannounced welfare check after receiving reports of concerning living conditions for a minor. Each encounter was professionally conducted but carried unmistakable undertones of coordinated harassment. Global Resource Enterprises was leveraging every administrative and regulatory lever available, creating a web of bureaucratic obstacles designed to exhaust their limited resources and patience. Sarah documented each incident meticulously, building evidence of corporate intimidation that Jessica believed could strengthen their legal position. What might have broken isolated individuals instead reinforced their determination. Sullivan had faced similar pressure decades earlier and had chosen principle over convenience. They would honor his example. The corporate strategy shifted when bureaucratic harassment failed to deter them. Private investigators began contacting Sarah's ex-husband, former colleagues, even Ethan's previous school, seeking information that might be used against them. These background inquiries focused particularly on Sarah's fitness as a parent, suggesting preparations for a custody challenge that would strike at her most vulnerable point. Jessica's warning came through Martha's secure channel. They are building a case for a custody intervention. They'll argue that the cabin's lack of modern utilities constitutes neglect, especially during winter months. We need to document how you're meeting Ethan's educational and developmental needs despite the unconventional setting. The threat to their family bond transformed abstract corporate pressure into deeply personal violation. Sarah channeled her fear into systematic documentation of Ethan's homeschooling progress, their adaptation to mountain living, and the supportive community connections they'd established. Martha Blackwell provided a sworn statement about Ethan's evident health and happiness. Jim Harris documented the boy's growing proficiency with practical skills that many adults lacked. Most powerfully, Ethan himself began maintaining a daily journal, documenting his educational activities and emotional well-being, creating contemporaneous evidence that directly contradicted any corporate narrative of neglect or deprivation. 20 days into the public notice period for their mining claim, Global Resource Enterprises escalated to direct legal action. Their formal challenge arrived in a thick envelope delivered by courier, 80 pages of legal arguments claiming superior rights based on historical connections to both Blackwell Mining and the Sullivan Family Consortium. Jessica Morrison spent 2 days analyzing the document before delivering her assessment. It's mostly procedural obstruction designed to intimidate you into settlement. Their historical claims have significant weaknesses, particularly regarding the forfeiture of Thomas Sullivan's inheritance rights. But fighting this will require resources beyond what we initially anticipated. The financial reality was stark. Contesting Global's challenge would require legal expenses far beyond their means, even with Jessica's reduced fees. The corporate strategy was working as designed, using their vast resources to exhaust the limited capacity of individual opponents. The turning point came unexpectedly. Word of their situation had spread through Pineville and surrounding communities, resonating with locals who had their own reasons to oppose Global Resources' expansion plans. The watershed implications of large-scale mining affected everyone in the region, not just those with direct connections to the disputed claims. A community meeting at the local Grange Hall drew a surprising crowd. Ranchers, small business owners, teachers, medical professionals, all concerned about corporate mining expansion. What began as general discussion evolved into concrete action when Jake Morrison, a local rancher in distant relation to Jessica, stood to address the gathering. "My family has worked this land for 3 generations. We've watched companies like Global Resource extract wealth and leave environmental damage for locals to live with. Sarah Winters isn't just fighting for her claim, she's fighting for all of us who want responsible development instead of corporate exploitation. I'm pledging $5,000 toward her legal defense. Who's with me?" The pledges that followed transformed their isolated struggle into community action. By meeting's end, over $30,000 had been committed to a legal defense fund administered by a local accountant. More importantly, a coalition had formed people with diverse skills and connections, united by opposition to extractive corporate practices that threatened their shared environment. Sarah stood before the gathered community, emotion tightening her throat. "When we bought that cabin for 50 cents, we were just looking for shelter. We never imagined finding ourselves in the middle of this fight. But Thomas Sullivan left his documentation for a reason. He believed the mineral wealth of these mountains should benefit local communities, not distant corporations. With your help, we can honor his vision." The newly formed coalition quickly expanded beyond financial support. Environmental consultants volunteered to assess the Willow Creek site and develop responsible mining plans that would protect watershed integrity. Political connections mobilized to ensure county commissioners understood the broad community support behind their claim. Security volunteers organized to counter corporate surveillance with their own monitoring network. Global Resource Enterprises responded to this community mobilization with increased pressure. Their surveillance teams became more numerous and obvious. Administrative challenges multiplied across various regulatory domains. The corporate legal department filed motions seeking to invalidate community support as improper third-party interference in a private property dispute. Most alarmingly, Sarah received notice that her ex-husband had filed for emergency reconsideration of their custody arrangement, citing reckless endangerment through inadequate living conditions. The timing and language mirrored Global's corporate strategies so precisely that Jessica had no doubt they had orchestrated and financed the legal action. "They're attacking on all fronts now," Jessica explained during a strategy session at Martha's home where secure communication was possible. "The custody challenge is particularly concerning. Family courts operate independently from mining claim proceedings, so even if we're winning on the mineral rights, you could still face separation from Ethan." The custody threat struck at Sarah's deepest vulnerability. Her scientific mind had approached the mining claim as a complex problem to solve an intellectual and procedural challenge. But the prospect of losing Ethan transformed the conflict from abstract legal principles to visceral primal fear. Global has miscalculated. Martha observed, her weathered face set in determined lines. They think threatening your family will make you back down. Instead, they've just made this personal for everyone supporting you. In mountain communities, we don't take kindly to outsiders threatening one of our own, especially not a child. The community response proved Martha right. When Sarah's ex-husband arrived for the preliminary custody hearing, he found himself facing not just legal arguments, but social consequences. The local hotel mysteriously had no vacancies despite empty parking lots. Restaurants experienced kitchen problems that delayed service indefinitely. The rental car company discovered mechanical issues requiring immediate attention. These weren't coordinated actions. No one had organized a formal boycott, but rather the natural response of a community that valued relationship over corporate influence. David Patterson found himself isolated in a hostile environment, his corporate sponsors notably absent when their legal strategy encountered rural solidarity. The custody hearing itself revealed how thoroughly Global had overplayed their hand. Sarah presented comprehensive documentation of Ethan's educational progress, physical health, and emotional well-being. Community members testified to his evident happiness and development. Most decisively, the social services representative who had conducted the welfare check testified that while the living situation was unconventional, it showed no signs of neglect or endangerment. The family court judge was unimpressed by David's sudden concern after months of minimal contact. His pointed questions revealed the externally motivated nature of the filing. Who provided the legal resources for this emergency petition? What specific evidence of endangerment prompted this sudden action? Why are you represented by a corporate law firm specializing in natural resource litigation rather than family law? The petition was dismissed with prejudice, the judge noting that any future filings would require substantial change in circumstances and evidence of actual rather than hypothetical concerns. This decisive defeat of one aspect of Global's pressure campaign energized the community coalition and strengthened Sarah's resolve. The corporation had revealed its willingness to attack her family bonds, confirming every ethical concern Sullivan had expressed in his journals. This wasn't merely a dispute over mineral rights, but a fundamental conflict between corporate extraction and community well-being. With the custody threat neutralized, Sarah and Jessica refocused on the mining claim itself. Global's formal challenge required detailed response connecting Sullivan's historical documentation to current legal standards. The coalition's resources made possible the expert witnesses and technical analyses that would have otherwise been beyond reach. 28 days into the public notice period, with their response to Global's challenge nearly complete, Ethan made a discovery that would transform their legal position entirely. While checking one of Sullivan's observation posts, he found a waterproof container wedged into a crevice between rocks, a container holding an old video camera and several sealed tapes. Sarah's hands trembled as she connected the camera to the small generator they used for essential electricity. The screen flickered to life, revealing Thomas Sullivan himself sitting in what was recognizably their cabin's main room, though decades younger and better maintained. If you're watching this, it means you found my documentation and decided to pursue the mining claims I was never brave enough to file myself. I hope you understand what you're getting into, because the people who want to control these mineral rights won't give up easily. The video continued for nearly an hour, Sullivan methodically explaining his geological work, his family history, and his decision to forfeit inheritance rights rather than participate in environmentally destructive mining operations. He provided detailed testimony about specific sites or quality and extraction considerations that would meet modern environmental standards. Most critically, he addressed the legal questions directly. These claims I'm documenting are legitimate and legal. I have surveying credentials from the Colorado School of Mines, and my geological assessments have been verified by 3 independent laboratories. More importantly, I've designed mining plans that would extract valuable minerals while preserving the landscape for future generations. The video concluded with Sullivan's direct statement of intention. I'm preserving this information instead of filing claims myself because I've seen what happens when mining companies prioritize profit over community welfare. The damage they cause last for generations long after the valuable minerals are extracted and shipped away. I'm trusting that whoever finds my work will understand that mineral wealth should serve local communities, not distant shareholders. Jessica Morrison's reaction to the video was immediate and decisive. This changes everything. Sullivan created contemporaneous testimony specifically to support future claims based on his work. It establishes his competency, validates his geological documentation, and provides clear evidence of his intentions. We need to submit this immediately as supplemental evidence. The timing proved critical. Global Resource Enterprises had filed last-minute additional challenges introducing complex legal theories about successor rights and inherited corporate interests. Sullivan's video testimony directly addressed these claims, explaining precisely why he had chosen to forfeit his inheritance rather than allow his family's mining interests to be absorbed by larger corporations. As the public notice period concluded, both sides prepared for the court hearing that would determine the validity of mining claim number 224-136. Global Resource marshaled an impressive legal team, 6 attorneys specializing in different aspects of mining law, corporate succession, and property rights. Their strategy relied on overwhelming the opposition with procedural complexity and technical challenges. Sarah's coalition countered with focused expertise. Jessica Morrison led their legal representation supported by specialists in environmental law and historical mining claims. The Community Fund provided resources for expert witnesses who could validate Sullivan's geological work according to modern standards. The courtroom itself reflected the community dimensions of the conflict. Local residents filled the public seating, their presence a silent statement of support for the principles Sullivan had preserved and Sarah now championed. Global's representatives sat isolated in their expensive suits, corporate authority carrying a little weight in this mountain courthouse, where relationships still mattered more than financial power. Judge Margaret Stone was known for careful attention to legal detail and impatience with corporate intimidation tactics. Her preliminary questions suggested she understood the broader implications of the case beyond the specific mining claim at issue. Mr. Williams, she addressed Global's lead attorney, your client claims superior rights to mineral deposits based on partnership agreements with Richard Sullivan. Please explain how those agreements remain valid after Mr. Sullivan's death in 1970 and the subsequent dissolution of the family mining consortium. The corporate lawyer's response was technically proficient but legally unconvincing. Global's claims depended on a series of contract amendments and successor agreements that had never been properly executed or recorded documents that existed in corporate archives but lacked official validation. Your Honor, Jessica Morrison countered, we have video testimony from Thomas Sullivan himself explaining why he forfeited his inheritance rights and what he intended for his geological work. His documented intention was to preserve these mineral deposits for community-based development rather than corporate exploitation. Sullivan's video played on a large screen that dominated the courtroom. His voice carried an authority and authenticity that no amount of corporate legal maneuvering could counter. It was the actual prospector speaking from personal knowledge about mineral deposits he'd spent decades documenting. The geological evidence is overwhelming, Sullivan said in the recording. These silver deposits are real, substantial, and accessible. But they should be developed by people who understand that the land itself is more valuable than anything you can extract from it. Judge Stone's questions following the video focused on technical details about mining law and environmental requirements, but her tone suggested she was impressed by the thoroughness of Sullivan's work and the legitimacy of Sarah's claims to continue it. Winters, the judge addressed Sarah directly. You understand that approving your mining claim will establish precedent for community-based mineral development throughout this region. Sarah straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of the moment. Yes, Your Honor, that's exactly what Thomas Sullivan intended and exactly what our community supports. And you're prepared to meet all environmental requirements and community impact standards. We've already prepared detailed environmental plans that exceed current legal requirements. Our goal is to prove that mineral extraction can enhance rather than damage local communities. The judge's ruling came swiftly and decisively. The court finds that Thomas Sullivan's documentation provides legitimate foundation for new mining claims, that his video testimony establishes clear intention for community-based development, and that Global Resource Enterprises has failed to prove superior rights to the disputed mineral deposits. Mining claim 224-136 is hereby approved and recorded. The courtroom erupted in cheers from community supporters while corporate lawyers huddled to plan their inevitable appeals. But Judge Stone's ruling had established legal precedent that would be difficult to overturn. Community claims based on legitimate geological work would receive equal consideration with corporate development proposals. "We won," Ethan whispered, his expression caught between amazement and relief. Sarah squeezed his hand, aware that their victory extended far beyond personal gain. "Sullivan won. We just had the courage to finish what he started." As they left the courthouse surrounded by celebrating supporters, Sarah looked back at the Global Resource legal team, packing their expensive briefcases with tense efficiency. The corporate machine had encountered something its resources couldn't simply overwhelm: a community united around principles that valued long-term relationship over short-term profit. Their 50-cent cabin had become the unexpected fulcrum for a shift in power dynamics that would reshape mineral development throughout the region. What had begun as desperate shelter had evolved into a platform for demonstrating that another approach was possible, one that balanced extraction with protection, profit with preservation. Sullivan's video testimony had provided more than legal vindication. It had given them his personal blessing for continuing his work, transforming their accidental discovery into purposeful inheritance. His final recorded words would remain with them as they moved forward: "Take care of these mountains, and they'll take care of you. That's the only wealth that really matters." The winter sunlight reflected off pristine snow as Sarah stepped onto the reinforced porch of the cabin that had once been their desperate gamble. 6 months had passed since Judge Stone's landmark ruling, and Blackwell Ridge had transformed around them. The roof, once punctured with leaks that threatened to wash away their meager possessions, now boasted quality shingles properly sealed against mountain weather. New windows gleamed in frames reinforced to withstand winter storms. A modest solar array on the south-facing slope powered essential appliances and communication equipment. Sarah watched the morning light paint the snow-covered pines with golden highlights, breathing in the crisp mountain air that had become home. Their 50-cent cabin had evolved from last resort to something neither she nor Ethan could have imagined when they'd first turned that rusted key. But the most profound transformations lay beneath the visible improvements. Inside, Ethan sat at a handcrafted desk that had replaced their makeshift table. No longer sleeping in borrowed sleeping bags on bare floors, they now had proper beds, functional furniture, and the basic comforts that once seemed impossibly distant. Geological textbooks, mineral identification guides, and his own research journal modeled after Sullivan's meticulous documentation spread across the polished wood surface. The stone fireplace crackled with well-seasoned wood, its chimney professionally inspected and sealed. On the walls hung framed maps, Sullivan's originals alongside their updated surveys. What had begun as desperate shelter now served as both home and operational headquarters for their fledgling mining enterprise. The morning's mail had delivered life-changing news. Ethan's application for early admission to the Colorado School of Mines summer geology program had been accepted. The same institution where Thomas Sullivan had studied would welcome his spiritual successor, closing a circle that spanned generations. "I still can't believe they accepted me. I'll be at least 4 years younger than everyone else in the program." Sarah smiled, placing a steaming mug beside his textbooks. "They didn't accept you because of your age. They accepted you because your application included original field research on silver deposits that impressed their admission committee. You've earned this through your own work." Their legal victory had established more than mineral rights. Judge Stone's ruling had created precedent for community-based resource management, recognizing the legitimacy of Sullivan's documentation and the validity of their approach to sustainable development. While Global Resource had filed expected appeals, the solid foundation of that initial ruling proved difficult to overturn. The community coalition formed during their struggle had evolved into a formal organization, the Sullivan Resource Cooperative, named for the man whose principles they sought to uphold. What began as defensive solidarity against corporate pressure had matured into collaborative governance, integrating diverse perspectives into resource management decisions. Their initial mining operation at Willow Creek had proceeded with deliberate caution. Rather than maximizing immediate extraction, they implemented Sullivan's measured approach: selective mining that preserved watershed integrity while yielding sufficient ore to sustain operations and fund community initiatives. The operation employed local workers at wages significantly above regional averages, creating economic ripples throughout surrounding communities. More surprisingly, their modified extraction process, developed from Sullivan's notes, had actually improved downstream water quality. The carefully designed filtration systems removed historical contaminants while preventing new pollution, challenging conventional assumptions that mining inevitably degraded environmental conditions. Global resource enterprises had pivoted strategies after their legal defeat. When direct challenges to Sarah's claim proved ineffective, they attempted to isolate the operation by pressuring refineries not to process her from non-affiliated sources. When community connections circumvented these obstacles, they tried purchasing adjacent properties to restrict access to the Willow Creek site. Each corporate maneuver encountered the same fundamental obstacle: a community network that prioritized relationship over profit, sustainability over extraction. Local landowners refused lucrative offers for strategic properties. Regional businesses established alternative supply chains, bypassing corporate bottlenecks. County officials expedited permits for community-based projects while subjecting corporate applications to appropriately rigorous review. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning's tranquility. Through the window, Sarah watched three mud-spattered trucks navigate the snow-dusted access road. The lead vehicle bore the newly designed logo of the Sullivan Resource Cooperative, a stylized mountain range with a silver river flowing through its heart. Jake Morrison emerged from the driver's seat, his weathered face framed by a heavy winter coat. The coalition meeting starts in an hour. Thought you might want to ride rather than risking your car on these roads. The coalition headquarters occupied the renovated Grange Hall in Pineville. Once a simple community gathering space, it now functioned as the operational center for their region's most ambitious project. Maps covered the walls, detailed surveys of mineral deposits throughout the territory Sullivan had documented. Tables displayed soil and water samples from potential mining sites, each analyzed for both mineral content and environmental sensitivity. Jessica Morrison directed the expanding legal team with characteristic precision. Their work had evolved beyond defensive responses to corporate challenges, now actively developing frameworks for community-based resource management that could be replicated in other regions facing similar conflicts. Today's meeting addressed their most significant decision since formation, whether to expand operations beyond the original Willow Creek site. Sullivan's documentation identified multiple promising deposits, each representing potential economic benefit balanced against environmental consideration. Sarah presented the environmental assessment developed with local experts, her chemistry background informing detailed analysis of watershed impacts. The coalition had established strict criteria for expansion. Any new site must demonstrate negligible impact on water sources, minimal disruption to wildlife corridors, and viable restoration planning for post-extraction remediation. Two sites met these stringent requirements, showing mineral concentrations justifying limited extraction while preserving ecological integrity. Both fell within properties owned by coalition members, eliminating contentious permitting battles with external landholders. The unanimous decision to proceed with careful expansion reflected the cooperative's commitment to Sullivan's vision: responsible stewardship, taking only what could be harvested without damaging systems that sustain both natural environment and human community. As the meeting concluded, Sarah noticed a newcomer entering the hall, a woman in her early 40s whose tailored business attire contrasted sharply with the practical clothing of coalition members. Her careful observation of the room suggested professional assessment rather than casual interest. Margaret Foster, the woman introduced herself, extending a business card that identified her as Director of Sustainable Resource Management for the Westland Environmental Trust. Our organization has been following your work with considerable interest. What you've accomplished here represents something unprecedented in modern resource development. The conversation revealed unexpected dimensions to their modest operation. The Westland Environmental Trust managed a substantial endowment dedicated to promoting sustainable resource practices throughout Western states. They had monitored dozens of community conflicts with extractive industries, documenting outcomes and searching for replicable models, balancing economic development with environmental protection. What makes your operation unique, Foster explained during their tour of Willow Creek later that afternoon, is that you've created a functional alternative to corporate extraction rather than merely opposing it. You're demonstrating that community-based resource management can be both economically viable and environmentally responsible. Recent snowfall had transformed the landscape, emphasizing the careful integration of their mining operation with surrounding terrain. Unlike conventional mines with sprawling disruption, The Willow Creek site occupied minimal surface area extraction focused on concentrated deposits identified through Sullivan's precise mapping. Most impressive is your water quality data. Foster continued reviewing monitoring reports. Most mining operations struggled to prevent contamination. Somehow you've actually improved downstream water quality through your filtration systems. Sarah explained their modified extraction process combining traditional techniques with innovative filtration that removed historical contaminants while preventing new pollution. The approach required more labor and yielded less immediate ore, but preserved watershed integrity essential for both natural systems and human communities dependent on clean water. The Westland Environmental Trust's interest culminated in a proposal delivered 1 week later, a substantial funding package that would expand their model throughout the region. The trust would provide capital for developing additional claims on environmentally suitable sites, while the Sullivan Resource Cooperative would supply expertise in sustainable extraction methods and community governance structures. This represents validation of everything Thomas Sullivan hoped to achieve. Jessica observed during the emergency coalition meeting called to discuss the proposal. His vision of responsible resource development will extend far beyond this single valley. The partnership offered more than financial support. It provided institutional backing against continuing corporate pressure connections to broader environmental networks and resources to document their methods for application in other regions facing similar conflicts between community welfare and extractive industries. For Sarah and Ethan personally, the partnership solved lingering financial challenges. The funding package included educational trust for coalition members' children, ensuring Ethan could pursue geological studies without constraint. It established research grants for developing improved extraction methods with reduced environmental impact, allowing Sarah to apply her scientific background to questions that had concerned Sullivan decades earlier. Global Resource responded to news of the partnership with a strategic shift. Rather than continuing legal challenges to the cooperative's specific claims, they accelerated acquisition of smaller mining operations throughout the region, consolidating control over processing facilities and transportation infrastructure. Their corporate attorneys filed motions questioning whether a community organization could legally enter partnerships with environmental trusts while maintaining valid mining claims. Richard Blackwell himself appeared at the cabin one crisp February morning, his corporate veneer slightly frayed by months of effective opposition. His luxury SUV created incongruous tracks in fresh snow, the vehicle clearly ill-suited for mountain conditions. Ms. Winters, I'll speak plainly. This situation has evolved beyond our initial disagreement over a single mining claim. What you're creating here threatens fundamental operational principles throughout the extractive industry. Global Resource is prepared to offer $3 million for full rights to Sullivan's documentation and immediate cessation of your partnership with Westland Environmental. The figure exceeded anything Sarah had imagined during those desperate days when 50 cents represented their total investment capacity. It offered immediate security, comfortable relocation, educational opportunities for Ethan without constant corporate opposition. The rational calculation seemed simple. Accept the offer, avoid continuing conflict, secure their future through cooperation rather than resistance. Mr. Blackwell, I appreciate your directness, so I'll respond in kind. This was never about money. Thomas Sullivan walked away from his family fortune because he understood that some principles matter more than profit. We've inherited not just his documentation, but his ethical framework. The silver will be extracted responsibly or not at all. Blackwell's expression hardened professional cordiality, giving way to genuine frustration. You realize this isn't over. My company has resources you can't imagine, legal strategies your coalition hasn't anticipated. We've simply been calculating whether removing obstacles through cooperation might prove more efficient than eliminating them through competition. His thinly veiled threat confirmed Jessica Morrison's assessment of Global's evolving strategy. Since Judge Stone's ruling, they had shifted from direct opposition to competitive domination, attempting to establish overwhelming corporate presence that would make the cooperative model appear unsustainable by comparison. The strategy became explicit the following week when permit applications appeared for 3 massive mining operations on properties adjacent to coalition holdings. The proposed developments dwarfed the cooperative's careful operations, with extraction volumes requiring substantial infrastructure development and creating significant environmental disruption. County commissioners found themselves caught between community pressure and corporate influence. While local sentiment strongly favored the cooperative's sustainable approach, global resource promised hundreds of jobs, substantial tax revenue, and infrastructure improvements that strained municipal budgets couldn't otherwise fund. The public hearing on Global's permit applications filled the courthouse beyond capacity. Coalition members presented detailed analyses of watershed impacts, wildlife disruption, and long-term environmental costs associated with proposed operations. Global's representatives countered with economic projections, job creation estimates, and technical assurances about contemporary extraction methods. The fundamental conflict transcended specific permit details addressing different visions for regional development. Global Resource represented conventional extractive economics, maximizing short-term yield, accepting environmental impacts as necessary costs, prioritizing shareholder value over community concerns. The Sullivan Resource Cooperative embodied an alternative approach, balanced extraction, environmental preservation, equitable distribution of benefits throughout affected communities. Sarah addressed the commissioners directly complementing technical data with ethical framework. Sullivan's vision wasn't about preventing development, it was about ensuring development serves community welfare rather than corporate profit. The silver beneath these mountains belongs to no individual or corporation. It represents natural wealth that should benefit those who live with both the resource and the consequences of its extraction. The commissioners delayed their decision, requesting additional environmental impact assessments before approving such substantial development. This procedural victory bought valuable time, but everyone recognized the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. Global Resource would continue pressing their extractive vision, adjusting tactics, while maintaining their core objective of resource control. During this period of uneasy equilibrium, Ethan made a discovery that transformed their understanding of Sullivan's legacy. While organizing materials for his Colorado School of Mines program, he identified inconsistencies in several geological notations, discrepancies between coordinates and descriptive text suggesting deliberate alteration. Pursuing this anomaly, Ethan identified a pattern across multiple documents. Sullivan had systematically adjusted certain coordinates, shifting them subtly from actual deposit locations. The alterations weren't random errors, but deliberate obfuscation, creating a secondary layer of information accessible only to someone who recognized the pattern. Mom, I think Sullivan created a failsafe, a way to verify whether someone finding his documentation actually lived in the cabin long enough to understand the landscape. These coordinate shifts all point to landmarks visible from specific windows. If you don't recognize the landscape references, you'd miss substantial deposits that aren't marked on the primary maps. This revelation explained why Global Resources geological surveys hadn't identified all deposits documented in Sullivan's records. Their corporate teams had treated coordinates as literal navigation points, rather than components in a larger system requiring intimate knowledge of the landscape. More significantly, the adjusted coordinates pointed to several substantial deposits on lands currently outside both cooperative control and Global's acquisition targets areas remaining available for new claims if properly documented. Sullivan had created not just documentation, but a verification system rewarding genuine commitment to the land he had protected. Jessica Morrison helped them file claims on these newly identified deposits using the coalition's established legal framework to secure rights before Global Resource recognized the pattern. Each new claim strengthened the community model, expanding sustainable operations while preserving core environmental principles. By early summer, the Sullivan Resource Cooperative had established controlling interests in most viable silver deposits throughout the region. Global Resource maintained large-scale operations on permitted properties, but found themselves unable to expand beyond initial holdings. The corporate extraction model and community-based alternative now operated in parallel, creating a natural experiment in contrasting approaches to resource management. The differences became increasingly apparent as operations progressed. Global sites featured standard industrial mining, large equipment, substantial surface disruption, visible impact on surrounding landscapes. The cooperative's operations maintained Sullivan's lighter approach, targeted extraction, minimal surface disturbance, continuous environmental monitoring and remediation. Most telling were water quality measurements taken downstream from both operations. Despite Global's technical compliance with regulatory requirements, their sites showed expected patterns of incremental degradation, not enough to trigger violations, but sufficient to demonstrate cumulative impact. By contrast, the cooperative sites maintain their unusual achievement of improved downstream conditions, filtration systems removing historical contaminants while preventing new pollution. These empirical differences attracted attention beyond local communities. Environmental researchers from several universities established monitoring projects comparing the two models. Economic analysts studied distribution of benefits, corporate operations generating concentrated profits for distant shareholders versus cooperative approaches circulating gains throughout local communities. Government agencies examined regulatory frameworks enabling or constraining different development models. Sarah found herself increasingly in demand as a speaker and consultant, explaining the cooperative's approach to audiences ranging from environmental conferences to legislative committees. The chemistry teacher who had once spent 50 cents in desperate search of shelter now advised policymakers on sustainable resource management frameworks. Ethan thrived in this evolving environment, his natural curiosity and Sullivan's methodical influence combining to develop remarkable geological aptitude. His summer program at the Colorado School of Mines transformed from introductory experience to substantive research opportunity when faculty recognized his firsthand knowledge of Sullivan's documentation methods. The Sullivan Resource Cooperative continued expanding through careful implementation of founding principles. New extraction sites adhered to strict environmental criteria, maintaining Sullivan's balance between resource utilization and landscape preservation. Processing facilities incorporated innovative technologies, reducing energy consumption and waste production. Training programs developed local expertise rather than importing specialized labor, building community capacity for sustainable management. Margaret Foster's prediction proved accurate. The cooperative had created a functional alternative to conventional extraction, demonstrating that community-based resource management could achieve both economic viability and environmental responsibility. The model attracted attention from other regions facing similar conflicts between extractive industries and community concerns. The partnership with Westland Environmental Trust expanded accordingly, supporting documentation and training that enabled other communities to adapt the Sullivan model to specific circumstances. What began as one man's principled stand against corporate exploitation evolved into a replicable framework for balanced development applicable across diverse contexts. The cooperative's success attracted international research interest. A team from the University of British Columbia's Sustainable Resource Management Program spent a month documenting the governance model that integrated environmental protection, economic development, cultural preservation, and intergenerational responsibility. Unlike conventional corporate structures with hierarchical authority flowing from investment stake, the cooperative framework balanced multiple interests in decision-making processes. This governance innovation attracted particular attention from researchers studying alternative development models. Traditional extraction typically created adversarial relationships between corporate interests and affected communities, with regulatory agencies attempting to mediate competing priorities. The cooperative approach demonstrated that community participation in management decisions could reduce conflict while improving outcomes across multiple metrics. The model gained further credibility when independent economic analysis confirmed that, while the cooperative generated fewer concentrated profits than Global's operations, it distributed benefits more equitably throughout affected communities. Corporate mining created higher paying but fewer jobs with substantial profits flowing to distant shareholders. Cooperative mining employed more local residents at slightly lower but still above average wages, with benefits circulating through local businesses and community initiatives. A significant challenge emerged in August when Global Resource attempted to restrict cooperative access to essential processing facilities. Having acquired control over regional smelting operations, the corporation announced policy changes that would prioritize processing for affiliated operations while implementing substantial surcharges for independent producers. The cooperative responded by accelerating development of their own processing capabilities. The Westland Partnership provided capital for small-scale processing facilities using experimental technologies that reduced both energy consumption and environmental impact. What began as defensive necessity evolved into another competitive advantage, localized processing, that eliminated transportation costs while providing additional employment opportunities. Global's increasingly aggressive competition prompted a surprising development. Several mid-level managers from their regional operations approached the cooperative with interest in transitioning to community-based extraction. These industry professionals had observed the cooperative's success firsthand and recognized the potential for balancing economic opportunity with environmental responsibility. The most unexpected validation came from an international mining industry conference where Global Resource and the Sullivan Cooperative were invited to present contrasting approaches to silver extraction. Technical data from both operations revealed that while Global's methods yielded higher short-term production, the cooperative's approach demonstrated superior long-term sustainability metrics, including groundwater quality, soil stability, and habitat preservation. This professional recognition coincided with the arrival of a letter that completed their connection to Sullivan's legacy. The Denver law firm's envelope contained documentation showing that Thomas Sullivan had established a conditional trust before forfeiting his inheritance rights. The trust stipulated that should anyone successfully implement his sustainable mining framework, they would be entitled to certain reserved assets from the original family holdings. Jessica Morrison vetted the letter's authenticity, confirming through legal channels that the trust indeed existed and had remained dormant for decades. Thomas Sullivan had created not just documentation but legal mechanisms to support whoever might eventually continue his work, providing resources that would sustain their efforts beyond initial implementation. The trust's assets, conservatively managed for 50 years, had grown to substantial value, not the billions that might have come from unrestricted extraction, but sufficient to ensure the cooperative's continuing operation, regardless of market fluctuations or corporate opposition. Sullivan had sacrificed immediate wealth but preserved resources for future implementation of his vision, believing that eventually someone would value principle over profit. This final piece of Sullivan's legacy arrived as the cooperative faced its greatest expansion opportunity. Margaret Foster had secured funding partnerships that would adapt their model to mineral deposits throughout Western states, creating a network of community-based resource management organizations operating on similar principles. The Trust's resources would provide essential stability during this transition, ensuring the model could develop sufficient scale to influence industry practices more broadly. The network launched at a regional conference hosted in Pineville, attracting representatives from dozens of communities facing similar conflicts between extractive economics and environmental concerns. Sarah presented the cooperative's results 2 years of operational data demonstrating that community governance could achieve sustainable outcomes while generating sufficient economic returns to support affected populations. Most compelling was the cooperative's core message: another approach is possible. Between unregulated extraction and complete preservation lies sustainable development, balanced resource utilization, respecting both human needs and environmental integrity. The silver beneath Sullivan's mountains had provided not just material wealth, but proof of concept for management frameworks applicable across diverse contexts. The conference represented a turning point for Global Resource as well. Recognizing the growing influence of community-based approaches, their board of directors initiated a strategic review of extraction practices throughout their operations. While maintaining their corporate structure and profit orientation, they began incorporating elements of the Sullivan model into their sustainability planning, particularly water management techniques and community engagement practices. This unexpected corporate evolution prompted mixed reactions within the cooperative. Some viewed it as victory-forcing industry-wide improvement through demonstrated alternatives. Others remained skeptical, seeing superficial adoption of sustainable practices without fundamental changes in corporate priorities. Sarah recognized both perspectives, understanding that meaningful change often emerged from compromise between ideal principles and practical implementation. For Ethan, the conference marked transition from student to emerging expert. Faculty advisors from the Colorado School of Mines invited him to collaborate on research, comparing extraction methodologies across different management models. His detailed documentation of cooperative practices formed the foundation for academic publications that would eventually influence industry standards beyond their immediate region. The expansion of their approach beyond local boundaries validated Sullivan's fundamental insight that responsible resource management required thinking across both geographic space and generational time. His 50-year preservation of knowledge, had created the possibility for transformative practices that might extend decades into the future. 1 year after Judge Stone's ruling, Sarah and Ethan hiked to Sullivan's favorite overlook a ridge, providing views across the entire valley. Summer wildflowers bloomed among granite outcroppings, creating vibrant contrast with the deep green forest below. The landscape showed evidence of both development approaches, Global's industrial operations contained within permitted boundaries, the cooperative's lighter impact sites distributed according to Sullivan's careful mapping. "Do you think we made the right choices?" Sarah asked, watching sunlight play across the valley that had become their home. "So many decisions, so many paths we might have taken differently." Ethan considered the question with thoughtfulness, matured through their shared challenges. "I think we made Sullivan's choices. He documented everything because he believed the right people would eventually find it and use it properly. And you think we're the right people. I think we became the right people by choosing to honor his legacy instead of just profiting from it. We could have sold everything to Global's, taken Blackwell's money, and lived comfortably somewhere else. Instead, we stayed and built something that matters beyond just us." The transformation wasn't merely financial, though their material circumstances had certainly improved beyond anything they could have imagined when purchasing the cabin. The deeper change involved purpose and relationship, connecting to a legacy extending backward through Sullivan's work and forward through the cooperative's continuing development. Their 50-cent gamble had yielded returns measured not just in dollars, but in community bonds, ethical framework, and demonstrable alternatives to extractive economics. The desperate woman who had bid on an abandoned cabin and the child who had followed her into uncertainty had found not just shelter, but purpose, continuing a work one principled man had begun decades earlier that would now extend into future generations. The cabin itself had transformed from desperate shelter to comfortable home, with modern amenities integrated without sacrificing essential character. Its reinforced roof, proper windows, and expanded living space maintained Sullivan's architectural vision while providing security that had once seemed impossibly distant. Yet its purpose transcended physical improvements, serving as living testament to values Sullivan had preserved through decades of isolation. As evening approached, they descended toward home. The cooperative's operations were winding down for the day, workers returning to families and community. Global's industrial site continued running additional shifts, maximizing production through extended hours. The contrast in approaches remained visible, but the competitive dynamic had evolved toward uneasy coexistence, each model demonstrating viability within different priority frameworks. Inside the cabin, Sullivan's journal lay open on the table, his final entry providing guidance that had shaped every decision since discovering his documentation. "The mountains will outlast us all. Our responsibility is to take only what we need and leave the land better than we found it." Sarah prepared dinner using vegetables from their expanded garden, watching as Ethan organized research materials for his next school project. Their conversation flowed easily between daily practicalities and larger questions about resource management, personal responsibilities, and community development. The integration of immediate needs with long-term vision reflected Sullivan's approach, practical engagement with tangible reality, guided by ethical principles transcending individual circumstance. As they ate, they discussed the cooperative's upcoming initiatives: watershed restoration beyond extraction, sites, educational programs for local schools, apprenticeships, developing technical skills for sustainable resource management. The conversation reflected how thoroughly they had absorbed Sullivan's perspective, seeing mineral extraction as just one component in a complex system of relationships between land resources and communities. Later, as stars appeared above the ridge, Sarah stepped onto the porch to appreciate the transition from day to night. The lights of Pineville glimmered in the distance, representing community connections that had transformed their isolated struggle into shared purpose. The darkness concealing Global's industrial operation offered visual reminder that alternatives often coexist rather than completely displacing established patterns. She recalled that desperate moment at the auction, standing before skeptical onlookers, as she offered 50 cents for a property everyone else considered worthless. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is bet everything on nothing at all," she had told Richard Blackwell. The statement had emerged from desperation masked by bravado, yet time had revealed its underlying truth. Their investment had yielded returns beyond calculation, not just silver from mountain stone, but purpose from necessity, community from isolation, principles proven through practice, rather than merely proclaimed through words. The cabin stood as physical testament to this transformation, its reinforced walls sheltering not just two individuals, but an idea powerful enough to challenge extraction models that had dominated resource development for generations. Within its renovated rooms, Sullivan's vision had found new life, connecting past principles to future possibilities through present action. The desperate bid had secured not just shelter but purpose, proving that value sometimes hides in what others dismiss as worthless, awaiting those with courage to invest when conventional wisdom counsels caution. As darkness settled completely over the valley, Sarah returned inside to find Ethan writing in his journal, documenting observations with the same meticulous attention Sullivan had shown decades earlier. The parallel wasn't coincidental, but represented genuine inheritance knowledge and values transferred not through blood relation, but through shared commitment to principles transcending individual circumstance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, coalition meetings addressing expansion proposals, environmental monitoring of existing sites, community discussions about balancing development with preservation. But tonight they could appreciate how far they had come from that first uncertain night in an abandoned cabin, sleeping bags spread on dusty floors, future hanging by the thinnest thread of possibility. The 50 cents that had seemed so desperate an investment had purchased not just property, but perspective recognition, that true value often hides beneath superficial assessment, awaiting discovery by those willing to look deeper. Sullivan had understood this when mapping silver deposits others overlooked. Sarah had embraced it when bidding on a cabin others dismissed. Ethan was extending it through research others hadn't attempted. This shared insight formed the foundation of their approach to both mineral extraction and community development, looking beyond immediate surface value to deeper possibilities, requiring commitment, knowledge, and ethical framework. The silver beneath these mountains had always been there waiting not just for discovery, but for responsible stewardship, aligning extraction with preservation, immediate benefit with long-term sustainability. As they prepared for sleep, Sarah made one final entry in her journal, continuing the documentation practice that connected her to Sullivan across generations, 2 years since discovery of Sullivan's legacy. Cooperative expanding to regional network. Ethan accepted to Colorado School of Mines. Global resource adapting elements of our approach. Sullivan's vision extending beyond single valley to potentially transform extraction practices throughout region. All from initial investment of 50 cents and commitment to principles that transcend immediate circumstances. She closed the journal, understanding that while their story might seem extraordinary, it represented possibility available whenever desperate circumstances meet principled determination. Sullivan's greatest legacy wasn't the silver he'd documented, but the vision he'd preserved, belief that responsible stewardship could balance resource utilization with environmental preservation, immediate needs with generational responsibility. Their 50-cent cabin had become the unlikely crucible for demonstrating this possibility, transforming not just their individual circumstances, but resource management practices throughout the region. The desperate woman seeking shelter and the child following her into uncertainty had become unexpected catalysts for systemic change, proving that sometimes the most significant transformations begin with the smallest investments, guided by the clearest principles.